Herzlich willkommen und hallo zu dieser Ausgabe von Böll.Global, der Heinrich
Welcome and hello. This is another edition of Böll.Global.
Böll.Global. I am Jan Philipp Albrecht. I'm one of the two co-presidents of the Heinrich-Böll Foundation, and I will continue to welcome you all in German. So in case you need interpretation, you will find interpretation as indicated in the chat down when you choose the language. So you can follow also my welcome speech in German and also furthermore the discussion. Herzlich willkommen nochmal.
So, a very warm welcome. I'm Jan Philipp Albrecht, one of the two chairs of the foundation of the Heinrich-Böll Foundation, and I'm happy to welcome you to Böll.Global, a series in which we bring international experts and experts in Germany together to discuss current topics. And we want to talk about the elections in the United States today, Donald Trump's re-election as the next president of the United States. It was a bit surprising for many, but for many it was also clear that he would win, and the respective majorities in the Congress and in the House of Representatives are a clear decision in terms of the political orientation of the nation. So we will have to check what this will mean for the upcoming legislature in the United States. We would like to talk about analyses, and we would like to focus on Washington and on Brussels. We have invited experts from both places, and we would like to ask the question, what analysis also with respect to the distance in time we are having right after the election night, and what does this mean with respect to the challenges in the United States, but also globally and, of course, for Europe and Germany? What does it mean from our perspective, and what does it also mean in particular with respect to the economy, to climate policy, to foreign policy, and to security policy? And we know that in those fields, the challenges with the new administration will be quite big. We will also ask what this will mean not only for your traditional political fields, but also with respect to democracy, to the public, with respect to democratic institutions in the United States and globally. Let me give an example. J.D. Vance, the incoming vice president, said in an interview that the regulation of X, the platform of Elon Musk, who will get an important position in the next administration, could be connected to the question of whether the company in question supports Ukraine. So this shows what impact the new administration will have, not only for the United States and within the US, and also with respect to the administration where key players will be replaced by others, but also with respect to the international community and the partners in the world, and especially also for Europe and our European partners and neighbors. And all this is what we will talk about this afternoon. I'm happy to welcome the audience, everybody who has joined us online, and will certainly be interested in further editions of Böll.Global. So I'm looking forward to our debate, and I'm happy to give the floor now to Leila Al-Zubaidi, who will be our host this afternoon. She is in charge of the respective units, and she's also the deputy chairperson of the respective department. Yeah, thank you, Jan. You have mentioned a number of important aspects already, and I hope we will have a chance to go into depth and detail. I'm happy to welcome our guests this afternoon, Alexandra Geese, member of the European Parliament, and please switch your cameras on so that we can see you. Alexandra Geese, MEP and Vice Chair of the European Green Group and an expert on digital policy. Max Bergmann, Foreign Policy Expert and Director of the Europe, Russia and Eurasia Program and the Stewart Center for Euro-Atlantic and Northern European Studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS. And Hannah Winnick, who since 2022 has been the head of our foundation office in Washington, D.C. We are happy to have you all here, and we are looking forward to your expertise. Now, let me give you an idea of what we will do here. I will ask questions to our guests, and after an hour or so, we will open to the public. So please, if you have questions or comments, use the Q&A functionality of Zoom. Alexandra has to leave us at 2:45, so she won't be here for the Q&A, but that's just for you to know. Hannah, may I start with you and an analysis of the election? Everybody expected a head-to-head run, a close race, and people also thought that the election result could potentially take weeks, but then it turned out quite differently, and Trump clearly won within one election night, and the Republicans are now controlling the Senate, and they also have a good chance of keeping the House of Representatives. So it's been a real walkover. What happened, I wonder? Well, thank you, Laila. Thank you, Max. Thank you, Alexandra. You're right. We expected a close race. It was still a bit difficult in some of the federal states, but all in all, he has won convincingly. The whole thing has moved to the right. If you look at the details, you see that in 90% of all districts, the voters have moved to the right, even in New York City, where normally you have a lot of Democratic supporters. But the proportion of votes for the Democratic Party has dropped there too. So we experience a dramatic shift in the US, and the question is what impact this will have. We are looking at the global trends, and we also see in the United States a very powerful anti-establishment mood, and people were really eager to think that the Biden government was to be blamed for everything that happened after the pandemic, and Harris could not free herself from this particular perception. 3/4 of the voters who were asked in a survey said that their families had been seriously or anyway affected by the price rises. And maybe I also need to tell you that during the pandemic in the United States, for the first time ever, they experienced a welfare state, children's money, family allowances, payments, interruptions with respect to the repayments of the student loans, which concerns millions of Americans. So there were measures people had never known before, had never seen before. We think this is a normal part of the infrastructure in Europe, but in the United States, it's different. But nothing of this continued after the pandemic. So people had this experience of loss, especially in lower income families, and this had a major impact on the mood with respect to the elections. Now, today, you hear Bernie Sanders say that the mistake the Democrats made was that they forgot about the working class, and they only focused on democracy and minority rights, so they just talk about identity policy. I think it's a somewhat simple or simplified argument. We don't have the numbers yet to confirm that Bernie Sanders is right, because Biden was the most trade union friendly government we've ever seen here. Sanders, however, says that there were a number of voter initiatives. People voted on, like, increasing the minimum wage or paying wage and salary even when people are on sick leave. And these initiatives were successful even in very conservative states. So He says, had we had a campaign, a democratic campaign with these topics, the Democrats would have won. It's an interesting perception, but I think it's also interesting with respect to the abortion right. So people voted on the one hand for Trump, but they also voted in many states for the right of abortion. So we don't have many data yet, but there is a general anger with respect to the system, and there is a real hunger for more just and welfare measures, which do not necessarily mean that the anti-right-wing movement gets support. So had the Democrats offered more or offered a better offer, they would have had better chances to get more voters. And later, I know I'm speaking a long time, but there is one more aspect I need to mention, because people also say that Harris did not really have much time for her campaign. And I would like to tell you why this is important, because this is a two-party system, and the major challenge for each political party is that they need to have a broad support. So they really have to get the support from the left wing up to the almost Republicans in the DP, right? And this is a major challenge. And in 2020, we saw that in the pre-election, in the primaries, there were lots of debates about contents and important issues. And at the end, there was a unity platform negotiated between Biden and Bernie. And the voters knew that even if Biden would not represent them, their interests would be considered. And this was substantial. This was important. And this process in this current election campaign was missing, i.e., the voters did not really feel represented by Kamala Harris, right? It wasn't her to, I mean, we cannot blame her, but this was the problem, was the reason why there was no real mobilization at the basis, and many voters, Democratic voters, did not vote. Yeah, thank you. Maybe the data, you said you are still evaluating the data and you haven't your analysis yet, or it's not finished. But what about young people? Could the Democrats enthuse young people? Because in Europe, we are also surprised about elections we had here, and young people often vote for the right-wing parties too. So what about the US? Now, concerning the data situation, right now we do have two types of data. The election results in the individual districts and boroughs. So we see how many votes Harris and Trump gained and how many votes went to third parties. And in many cases, you can go and say, okay, this is a very Latino-based city or a rural region, and then you have an idea of who voted for whom. The other data are based on these so-called exit polls made on election day. And of course, we can base speculation on these numbers, but these data are not yet reliable because these are opinion polls. And you cannot really rely on those surveys. So you do not want to go too deep into the analysis on the basis of these data. We have to see in the upcoming months whether we get better data in order to really work on an analysis, like who did the young voted for, who did the Latinos and Latinas voted for.
Thank you so much, Hannah. You'd like to add something else or anything else, other insights? We are also interested in foreign policy issues. Was this of importance during the campaign or during the run-up to the campaign?
Funktioniert es mit der Übersetzung?
I hope this...
Can you hear me?
Max, do you hear me?
Sorry,
Yeah.
I wasn't sure if that was
So,
directed.
sorry.
Yeah. Well, first, thanks so much for having me. No, I don't think foreign policy played a huge role in this election. However, it did create a sort of sense amongst the electorate that things weren't going well in the world. Both the war in the Middle East, as well as the war in Ukraine having dragged on, I think created a sense that that things were going awry. I think that generally hurt Kamala Harris and the incumbent party. Usually the president is blamed and credited for anything that goes wrong or goes right in the world or in the country. And in this case, I think that had an effect. I also think that that President Biden had sort of ceased to become an effective messenger about U.S. foreign policy and an effective messenger to the electorate. And so the fact that the United States wasn't actually at war, this is the first election that we've had since 2000, where the United States has not actively been engaged in military combat. Yet the incumbent Democratic Party got no credit for that, because I think the perception was that the world was aflame. And I think if you had a younger Joe Biden that had been running a la 2012, when he came up with a very snappy line that that Osama bin Laden is dead and Detroit and the Detroit car industry is alive, he would have marketed the fact that America is no longer at war and he has ended the forever wars. Despite the fact that Afghanistan didn't go well. But everything, I think, from a messaging perspective, when it came to foreign policy, was negative. And then, of course, when you sort of unpack the electoral impacts of U.S. support for Israel, of the war in Gaza, that definitely, I think, eroded Democratic support, not just amongst Arab Americans, but I think amongst young people. And added to kind of a general sense of disenchantment with the Democratic Party. And you saw this most specifically in various parts of Michigan, where there are large Arab populations, where I think Donald Trump won Dearborn, Michigan. Now, they might, I think Arab voters might be scratching their heads after Mike Huckabee, the former Arkansas governor, has just been appointed, who doesn't recognize the West Bank as being Palestinian territory. But I think that showed the general disenchantment with the Biden administration's support for Israel, and also lack of their kind of really confronting Netanyahu about what I think many in the U.S. foreign policy establishment see as a war that is really going nowhere, especially in Gaza. So I think that had a negative impact. Maybe just quickly on the war in Ukraine, I think what Europeans and I think the Ukrainians have really failed to recognize is that while there is strong support for the war in Ukraine in the United States, and I think it's above 60%, the fact is, when you look at what polling when it comes to the American public's view of foreign policy, their number one concern is to not get in any war. And so what you saw during the election was President Biden gets a lot of criticism from the Ukrainians for being weak and slow, and some of that is true and some of that is really overblown. But Joe Biden is the hawk. Joe Biden was the hawk in this race, and then it became Kamala Harris that was the hawk in this race. And you saw in both of the two debates that we had, Trump advocating what would be a position far to the left of the Green Party, worried about escalation, not wanting the U.S. to be pulled into a conflict. And so that really, I think, constrained the politically the Democrats' hand to some degree, and constrained Republican support for Ukraine, because it took a long time for us to get Ukraine assistance through our Congress. And so what we saw is the United States supporting Ukraine, but anything that would sort of potentially drag the U.S. deeper into war was something that Donald Trump was highlighting, And so you see just in the week after the election, the administration announcing that it's going to allow military contractors to provide technical services on F-16s, a critical thing that we do all around the world. But we were refusing to allow boots on the ground, even if contractors, I think because of concern that Donald Trump would weaponize that to say, look, the United States is being pulled into a conflict, and the American public would then react against that. And I think has served as a major constraint in U.S. U.S. Willingness to support NATO enlargement, other topics like that.
Ja, vielen Dank. Du hast jetzt schon einiges angesprochen, worauf wir später auch noch mal eingehen
Thank you so
werden.
much. You've addressed some of the issues we are going to delve deeper when it comes to foreign policies, the conflicts you've mentioned, and the analysis of the election. Jan mentioned Vance when he began, and the regulation of X in Europe. This could have an impact, a negative impact on the support for Ukraine by the US. Alexandra, you work a lot with digital politics, and this campaign is also quite special with the special involvement of Elon Musk. What do you think about his share and his influence in this run-up to the election? He could he had a lot of influence, and he, of course, is the owner of this platform and this communication network. But X is the platform where we see the trends, where the journalists are, where the scientists are, and the people who can continue to bring up these topics on other platforms, and then at the end also in the traditional media. So this network is extremely important and powerful, and Musk used to use this and he had banned some accounts and personalities, and he reopened the accounts, and there had been people who had written anti-Semitic and far-right remarks, and had also issued a lot of lies. So these people went online again, and there was a huge rise in anti-Semitic issues. And this was even before the war in Gaza. So there was a very black and white scenery there. And what we read in newspapers, he changed the algorithms of Twitter, of X, so his own content is having the farthest outreach and range. We don't know exactly about the content, if there had been an impact on the accounts of other politicians, but he optimized his own accounts. And this is the first thing. Then the second item is his financial influence, talking about venture capitalists. There was support, there was mobilization for the campaign, and there were people who said very clearly, we don't want to have any regulation at all. And the interesting question is, will this be the same case in Europe or not? And we are debating very much on this. This is a very topical issue. But we're not just talking about Musk alone. It's about other platforms too. So they are platforms that are labeled leftish by right-wing people, Google or Meta. They have mechanisms that polarizing topics will have a lot of outreach, something like disinformation, hate speech, racist, sexist issues. And Musk, Vance, and Trump didn't hold back on that. And when it comes to this kind of content, they provoke. There is a lot of interaction, a lot of engagement being triggered through that, and they use this. and in order also to play others, and this also sets the tone. And people who focus on that, they become very, very visible, and their topics too. And this is what has an impact on the decision in the election. The question, why are there people who voted against the system, especially after the pandemic, where we see a certain focus on welfare, then of course the abortion topic. But I think if we would work on democracy and other issues, not just for elites, but for the broader part of the society, I think we should do that. We should focus that when it comes to content, but I don't think it's a good strategy for the election campaign. It's again about the question of cultural wars and the outreach on the networks. And Musk works with a lot of lying and shouting out and other of these strategies. And this is the basic problems. If I'd be able to add something, and Alexandra is pointing into the right direction. Trump has invented or has made a completely entirely new way of election campaigning. So this knocking on doors, for example, and he had also delegated a part of this to Elon, and he didn't do a traditional campaign as we know them for decades in the US. And this is also a question coming up for the Democrats. Is it worth to have a traditional campaign? Does it make a difference? Some look to the swing states. She didn't win, but she lost less. But the question Alexandra is bringing up, how to campaign in these times with digital platforms that are very clearly supporting right-wing people. This is a very important issue. Thank you so much. And these are some lessons we have to learn in Europe too, and this will come up here too. And the question is, how to reach out to people. Do we have to shout louder too? And when it comes to the own electorate and how to convince them with the agenda, how the communication ways have changed. And Alexandra, the transatlantic relationship, this is a very important topic. How will the relationship be shaped from an American background? Max, in Germany and in Europe, we are worrying that Trump may see Europe and Germany as enemies, and maybe there are different stance on the NATO. What are the most important pillars of his European politics? What do you think?
Well, it's a big question, and I guess I would say I think it's going to be a really bumpy ride for NATO and for the transatlantic relationship. I think there's a bit of a contradiction within the Trump world, where I think on the security side, so those focused on foreign policy in that are coming into government, firmly believe that they need to pull back from upholding European security, that it is time to transfer the responsibility for protecting Europe to Europeans, and view Europe very negatively, and that America has been taken advantage of, and really subscribe to Donald Trump's contempt for NATO. And so I think there's a very earnestly held view that the United States should not be playing the current role that it's doing in Europe on the defense side. Now, the contradiction is that on the economic side, on the trade, whether on tech, on climate policy, all these other things, and you saw this with J.D. Vance's comments about Elon Musk, where what he said was, well, if we're providing your security, how could you take action against Twitter? So the contradiction is that on the economic and digital and other side, they want to hold the security side hostage and say, well, we'll pull back unless you make all these concessions to us on the security side. Meanwhile, the security folks are going to implement a pullback. So I think it's going to be confusing. I think Europeans will come and think that they can strike a deal with deal maker Trump. And I think they're just not going to be able to, because what is going to happen is there's going to be clash after clash on the other areas, whether it's tariffs, whether it's the EU taking, implementing its regulations vis-a-vis X or Twitter, climate policy, if you're going to implement a carbon border adjustment mechanism or all other aspects of the Green Deal, that is going to have a direct clash with the United States. And so this is going to happen again and again and again. And the Trump administration is going to say, we're going to pull back on the security side. And so I think the larger philosophical question for Europe is the way the United States, Russia, and China all view Europe is that Europe is a vassal of the United States, and that you are essentially do what we want. That is how it's perceived. That's how the Kremlin perceives. That's how Beijing oftentimes thinks about Europe, and how Washington thinks about Europe, that your job is to prioritize what we prioritize. And so the question is Europe going to do that? And I think it's up in the air. I think the German election might have a lot to do with that. But right now, it looks like Europe is very divided. In Europe, the question is whether Europe will be cohesive in developing a response. I tend to think that Europe is forged in crisis, and that when the European Union is challenged, that it actually ends up becoming very strong. And I think this is going to be one of those moments, but it is a major question, where you're going to have a number of European states that are going to be looking to just cut deals, want to weaken European resolve vis-a-vis the United States. And then also, I think a number of people in Germany don't want to spend the money that it will require to not just support Ukraine, but also to handle European security. And then also, Europeans don't want to take the hard bureaucratic steps that were needed to begin integrating their militaries and their defense, and how they think about defense is not just a national focus, because the threat really isn't to Belgium or to Germany, it's to Europe. And so how Europe then addresses its defense is going to raise all sorts of really difficult questions. And so the onus will be on Europe, and then Trump is going to put all this pressure on Europe to be weak, and to just sort of come bended knee to Washington. And the question is, what will Europe do in response?
Danke, Max. Bevor Alexandra, du
Thank you, Max. Now, before Alexandra will take the floor, tell us a bit more about the preparation, but I would like to ask Hannah. Marco Rubio will probably be at the head of the State Department. Will Europe be able to negotiate with him? It's relative, I'd say. We thought that Rick Grenell, the former US ambassador in Germany, would be the next Secretary of State, which would have been a problem for Germany, because there were major tensions between the then German government and the ambassador. So Rubio might be better. He is experienced in the government, in Congress. He's been a member of the Republican Party for a while. He's not been always a member of the Trump world. He criticized Trump, but then he apologized. That is to say, he's not one of the ideological leaders in the Trump crew. Could you maybe tell us what MAGA means, since you just said MAGA? Make America Great Again. That's what MAGA stands for. He's also one of the senators who adopted a law which might make it more difficult for Trump to opt out of NATO. So he does see the value of NATO, but he also talked about Ukraine. And he said he wanted to have a quick end of the war. This is the key issue for him. That's what He said so he will probably follow Trump and Vance on their proposal with respect to peace negotiations. He's also very much against China, as most Republicans and also many Democrats, by the way. And his reputation in Washington is, well, he is not always convinced. He is also a bit opportunistic. He is not that influential in Trump's circles. Maybe Max won't agree with this description, but we will have to see how long he can stay in the next government at all. Thank you, Alexandra. The EU has better prepared in view of the next Trump administration. What does this mean with respect to foreign policy, with respect to security policy? They are connected, of course. And would you agree to Max with respect to the biggest challenges we are seeing, or are there more concerns? Well, yeah, actually, I agree to Max. I share his view. I think we've tried to prepare a lot, especially in the field of defense policy. But as Max has told you, it's not that easy, because there is not just one government in Europe which can go and say, okay, let's put more money in the budget and have more defense spending. It's 27 member states, and the EU is but a coordinating agency. Now, there will be a commissioner who will also be in charge of defense soon, but there's also the High Commissioner for Foreign and Security Policy. So you do see quite a bit of coordination activities that are necessary in order to act in the field of politics, and Max described the details. I'm a bit more positive with respect to the willingness. I do see the willingness to do all this, especially in Germany, and with the Russian invasion in Ukraine. This is seen by many people in the country, but still it takes a while until all this is being implemented. But the coordination with other countries is problematic, and lots of national interests are involved here too. And there was also the hope that the situation won't get as worse, as bad as it is. We have also had the hearings of the new commissioners of the EU Commission, and they need a positive vote from the plenary before they can start working. And I do hear many who say they agree to transatlantic relations, no matter who rules. However, we realize that we have to wait for the reality yet. And there will be a reality check in the future, and we will see whether negotiations and deals are possible. People will hope that this can be done, but it won't work as well as it worked before. I mean, the positions that are open still will be filled quickly, and the respective policy will be implemented, and this will not always be in accordance with the European value. And I'm not sure whether there is the willingness to make so many deals as we did in the past. And secondly, I think that Europe is not a monolithic unit. I mean, it's the EU Commission, but it's first and foremost 27 member states who matter most in the field of foreign and security policy. The EU Commission doesn't really have a say in the foreign and security policy. So the question is, what will 27 member states do? And they will certainly act differently. Italy under Meloni or Hungary under Orban has certainly a different relationship with Trump than members of the government or heads of state and government in more progressive countries. So there will be a real difference. And the question is whether consensus is possible at all. And we also see a number of political differences also within the European institutions. The EU Commission under Ursula von der Leyen is led by the Christian Democrats, and they are very much in favor of a transatlantic relationship, and they also want to defend Ukraine very much. Along which line will the countries act, and what will be the economic differences? We wonder. Germany certainly has a major interest in low tariffs. They don't want to have high tariffs because Germany is an exporting country, and Musk, with respect to Tesla, maybe less so with X, but with respect to Tesla, will certainly have different interests because he wants to sell cars. And Germany and Europe have been divided already with respect to the sanctioning tariffs, with respect to China trade. So I do see a number of challenges also with respect to the China policy of the United States, which will have an impact on the European economy too. However, I hope that Max is right. I think Europe is standing together in moments of crisis, and we hope that it will be stronger and overcome its weaknesses. In an hour, I will know more because we will talk about transatlantic relations in the plenary. Yeah, thank you. Maybe quickly asking you, Max said Trump will certainly benefit from the divides and fissures and ruptures in the EU. And then you have Orban and Meloni and others who are parts of the group of autocrats in the world, and they are still members of the EU. So are you seeing any preparation in the EU with respect to this particular situation? Are there concrete steps which can be undertaken? Yeah, I mean, there are talks among the governments and also within the European Parliament. Right now, the Green Party is also talking with the Christian Democratic Party. The question is, what do you mean by concrete steps? And also within the Christian Democratic Party, they are closer to the parliamentary group, a right-wing extremist parliamentary group, where Meloni's party is a member. So there are two trends among the Christian Democrats. There are those who are very much in favor of the transatlantic alliance and very much in favor of Europe. And on the other hand, you have pragmatists and people who say, okay, the world is moving to the right, so we will have to move to the right too. And this is why concrete steps right now are difficult, because there are still power struggles going on right now. I mean, we will vote on the EU Commission in 2 weeks, and then we will see who will be the commissioners. So concrete steps for the time being, there are none, because there are no clear alliances for the time being. And the Christian Democrats are undecided, and they are also looking at the right-wing extremists in the European Parliament. I mean, that's a matter of evidence. Like you heard a member of the Christian parliamentary group saying in a radio program, we need to get rid of the Greens, for example, and the Social Democrats, but this is not what Ursula von der Leyen and the EU Commission want. So there are still struggles and debates going on, and this is going to be exciting to observe in Europe in the next few weeks.
Thank you so much, Alexandra. Am I right that you are going to leave now? Okay, you have to leave. Yeah, I'm deeply sorry. I'm terribly sorry about that. Thank you so much. Bye. We're going to continue moving on to the climate politics. During his first term of office, he pulled back from the Paris Agreement. And what does Europe have to prepare for? Hannah, you'd like to start? Yes, during his first term, he pulled out of the Paris Agreement, and we all believe he's going to do that again. And maybe he will even leave the UN general framework on that. So there won't be any new funding on climate. The damage fund, for example, that has been set up last year. And there was no support for that by the Republicans in Congress. We have to think also about private funding, export initiatives. And when it comes to the national level, the climate activists, they will try to defend what has been achieved under Biden and fight against a broader application of fossil fuels. And some may have heard about a new project for 2025, the regulations of the private protection agencies. This has to be weakened and more permits in order to drill for gas, for example, without any environmental or less environmental exams before. The IAA had been the huge climate agreement under Biden, and we hope that there will be funding also for Republican federal states. There are also voices among the Republicans who'd like to continue with help and fiscal support for green projects. So the question is, who is going to win within the Trump administration, but a lot of the legislation will be weakened, and all the measures for green tech, clean energy, for example, will be weakened. And there are, however, different interests within the administration, and there are people like Musk who benefit from this supports, and then there is the question of the expertise. A quarter of the environmental ministry left their jobs on a voluntary base. We have to think what is going to happen now in the second term of office, and then there is also strategy of political cleansing by the Trump administration. So it's foreseen that a lot of civil servants will be fired and or made redundant, and so this will also be a huge drain of talent and expertise. So this is not looking very well and not giving exactly out a lot of hope when it comes to climate politics. Just a little bit of hope are the democratic federal states that said even the day after the election in California, in Washington, we are going to continue with a very ambitious climate politics. And so it's also the question about the supranational politics between Germany and other federal states here in the United States. Thank you so much, Hannah. Max, you'd like to add something? Or maybe we move on to the larger conflicts you've already mentioned before?
Yeah, well, I think Hannah did a very good job on where things stand on the climate side. It's not super bright. On the other hand, I just echo that the Inflation Reduction Act, that most of the money is going into Republican states. So perhaps unfortunately for Germany or for many in Europe that reacted negatively to the Inflation Reduction Act providing subsidies, I think those subsidies will remain. I think what we've also seen is that some in the oil and gas community and the business community, such as the CEO of ExxonMobil, have written a letter to President-elect Trump saying, please don't withdraw from the Paris Climate Accords. And I think many in the business community find it quite frustrating that we're going back and forth between, an administration will put on all these environmental regulations, and then another one will come and take off all these environmental regulations. Then 4 years from now, another, potentially a new Democratic administration, we'll see, comes in and puts back all those environmental regulations. So I think there's a degree of wanting some certainty, which may create somewhat of a check on on some of the regulatory rollback that we might see. Also, I think many companies have probably already made certain plans to maybe take action against, methane if you're an oil and gas company, and they may not, stop doing what they're doing. We'll have to see. My guess is that when it comes to climate, that the Silicon Valley, the private sector, will sort of continue its onward march, and that we will see emissions reductions in the U.S., just not anywhere near where we need to be to meet our Paris targets or to kind of live up to international expectations. So I think we are not going to see America going fully backwards, but on the other hand, we're not going to go, I think, as forward as we need to be. One other thing is that the big question is Elon Musk, given his unparalleled influence right now with President Trump, we'll see how long that lasts. He is there because of basically public subsidies to his company, and he runs one of the largest, if not largest, EV company in the world, electric vehicle company in the world. The question is, does he want to get rid of subsidies because Tesla has already reduced its costs and basically pull up the ladder to prevent being challenged? So is he going to take a very oligarchic monopolist view, or is he going to actually try to keep some of the climate protections, because he does believe climate change is happening, and does he sort of exert that influence? It's an open question, remains to be seen. He's been put in charge of the Department of Government Efficiency, which is a government agency that does not exist in real life. And so there's a lot of people scratching their heads about, is this just a fake job given to Elon Musk? And we'll see if they are actually able to implement some of what they're saying of firing 75% of workers and reducing the government by a third or two-thirds, whatever it is. The government in the US is the military. So to reduce it by that much, it's very hard to see that happening. And if it does, then there'll be a huge political backlash. And so that will sort of rub up against the reality of American politics.
Danke, Max. Ich hätte auch gerne noch eine Frage gestellt zum Verhältnis von
Thank you so
Silicon Valley
much,
allgemein
Max. I'd like to hear about the relationship with the Silicon Valley and the campaign, but it won't be doable here due to time limits. Hannah wrote also an article about that, which is going to be issued today, I think, on our website, about the relationship also between Silicon Valley and Obama, and that there are also right-wing stakeholders there too who supported Trump. And we always talk in Germany about Musk and others, but there has been a general change. And this is also quite important that we understand that. Max, I'd like to go back to the situation in Ukraine and in the Middle East. And Rubio, you've mentioned that too, that he's supposedly someone who may have peace talks with Putin, and Zelensky tried to come closer to Trump in the recent months. Are there voices in Washington who say or think that this could be helpful, or will it be very difficult with regard to further support for Ukraine? What do you think?
So I am very pessimistic about the situation in Ukraine, and just to be very blunt about it, right now the military situation is not great for Ukraine. It looks like they are on the military back foot. It looks like they are losing this war. And so when I project ahead to January 20th, when the Trump administration comes to office, the question I ask myself is, why would Vladimir Putin negotiate? Now, Russia is having really high casualties, about 1,500 a day. It's shockingly high. Their economy is in some ways doing very well. On the other hand, there are signs of real problems, especially high inflation. Yet, if you're Putin and you look at a Donald Trump administration, the major question you're going to ask yourself is whether a Trump administration, a Trump White House, will submit to Congress a 60 billion or 100 billion, whatever it may be, massive supplemental package for Ukraine, which we passed in April after 8 months of fighting in Congress. My sense is that it's going to be very difficult to do politically for Donald Trump. I don't think he wants to do that. I think there's a sense that we as in Donald Trump ran on America first, and so the idea of sending another huge aid package to support Ukraine is something they're not going to want to do. I am very pessimistic about that happening, and I think the kind of notional attitude by the Trump White House is Europe should do it. And that would be great. I think Europe could afford to do it and should take action. On the other hand, Europe does not have the stockpiles of weaponry nor the defense industrial capacity to meet Ukraine's military needs in 2025 and to fill any gap that Ukraine will have if U.S. aid is cut off. So I look at this notion that Donald Trump is going to come and there's going to be talks on day one or a ceasefire on day one, and the war is going to end on day one is utterly ridiculous. Now, there may be talks. The Russians are very good at engaging in nonsense talks that go absolutely nowhere and drawing things out while the fighting still continues. So I am very pessimistic about the Ukraine's chances. I also look at the Trump White House and the Trump administration and see no one that will really want to be engaged in what will be incredibly intense negotiations with Russia, with Ukraine, especially when Donald Trump has a very checkered relationship with Vladimir Putin. And you don't see any Russia experts in the Trump orbit. Now, Marco Rubio, quite interestingly enough, is noted as a major China hawk, and indeed he is. But before that, he was a major Russia hawk. Yet he voted against Ukraine, the Ukraine assistance. And I think he did that not because he's soft on Russia, but because he wanted to be aligned with Trump. And so when I look ahead, I don't see anyone in the Trump administration really wanting to run with this issue, to really run with negotiations, to act like what would Richard Holbrooke during the Balkan Wars. So I don't see necessarily the political will. I don't see how Vladimir Putin comes to the table. What interest does he have to negotiate to end a war that he is winning? And just imagine another year of fighting, and he could actually win. His forces might be able to get to Kyiv and really topple the Ukrainian government. And so I am quite pessimistic that Trump's intervention in this war is going to be positive. And I think I hope I am wrong, but that's presently where I think it's going to be quite bleak for Ukraine over the next year.
Ja, danke, auch wenn das sehr düstere Aussichten sind. Und wir natürlich hoffen, dass die EU da.
Thank you so much. We can just hope that the EU can compensate for that. Unfortunately, there's no time left. I wanted to address two more topics. The conflict in the Middle East and Trump's close relationship to Netanyahu and the Saudi Arabian crown prince and the broadening conflict. We won't make that. We cannot address China either, but I hope we can do that in a different setting. But I'd like to give the floor to our audience and their questions. But before doing so, leaving the foreign politics behind and maybe have a glance towards the American democracy. This is not just important to the US Americans, but for others in the world too, for us too. What have the institutions to expect under second term of office, Hannah? And what about your work with progressive democratic stakeholders? Is this the beginning, the start of the American democracy, or are we just far too pessimistic.
I would dare a real forecast, but I think Trump understands the election result as a signal and opportunity to do away with a lot of democracy. And there is a plan which has been published partly. We know that there is a number of right-wing experts, selected ones who do agree on the politics. And this time we are learning very fast about who is going to fill which vacancy and then the new office of Musk in order to enhance the efficiency of the government. Many people will have to leave and they will also give up a lot of information. And there is also a playbook for the first 108 days, which has not been published yet. We do a number of orders and ordinances have been written already and can be released right away, including mass deportations. Trump has often mentioned the mass deportation of 11 to 12 million people who live without documents in the United States. And this is going to happen fast. I mean, this has to be approved by the House of Representatives. But if the Republicans get the majority in the House of Representatives and in the Senate, they can adopt those laws and there will be a major swing to the right. And this goes along with the judges at the Supreme Court. I mean, the system which has protected the democracy for a long time, including acts which had been adopted by the right-wing Congress, had to be brought to the law courts. All this is not possible anymore. There are no counterweights anymore. If the Trump administration wants to apply laws against public protests, there is no one who can intervene. If he wants to use the Ministry of Justice in order to act against his political opponents, he can do this much better. It's going to be much easier than it was in the past. So the goal of the MAGA movement is to enhance the centralized state and to have more power in order to also intervene on the federal state level. That's new. For a long time, the US have been a decentralized system, so the citizens knew this is a democratic state, and even if there was a right-wing Congress, they knew that their rights were protected. But this is not the case anymore, and there will be more intervention on the federal state level and reduction of rights. And the only hope I do still have is that the federal states know it and they have to prepare. They prepared already, and in the very first hours and days, we heard from Democratic governors that they are preparing for such a situation, and they are also willing to act against this trend. Well, maybe a question. Apparently, there is a resolution in the House of Representatives which has not been approved yet, but which is to be fast-tracked. They say, i.e., withdraw this tax exemption from NGOs which allegedly support terrorism. I mean, can this be a weapon used against a critical civil society? What do you think, Hannah? Yeah, right. That's exactly the acts and the legislation we are fearing. I mean, it couldn't be adopted in the last office term, but it can be adopted now. In the last term, there were lots of Democrats who did not support it because this was also connected to tax exemptions for families with members who had been taken or held hostage. But now this can be adopted, and it will have a major impact on the civil society. And even if it cannot be adopted in this current office term, it will happen in the next one. And the impact will correspond to what you see in Hungary today, right? So use of the concept of terrorism as a tool, and this will apply to climate activists who protest against nuclear power plants, or human rights people who are pro-Palestine or supporting pro-Palestine resolutions. So there is a broad range of topics. And this certainly undermines the infrastructure, the very infrastructure of the civil society, which had allowed for a resistance in the past. Thank you. Well, we do hope, of course, that you won't be affected too much. Although you've told us recently that critical players and activists in society do have problems with the political violence already, and there is a certain climate of intimidation in the country. We do have a number of questions in the chat. One is immediately connected to what you've just said. What about the US civil society? How do they prepare? What topics will they refer to or focus on? How will they protect themselves? And what does it mean for foreign institutions and organizations? Hannah, maybe you can give an answer. Yeah. The ACLU, one of the biggest civil rights organizations in the country, has prepared. They are also adopting legal strategies. They know what Trump has announced with respect to trans people and indigenous people and many others. So the ACLU has sued the idea already, or has gone to court, because there are also judges who don't support the MAGA idea, but there are also activists and militants who mobilize again. But there is a certain fatigue too. We do see a certain fatigue in the civil society, which is very different from what we saw in 2016. So there is not that spirit anymore, the spirit which had brought people to the streets on the very same day of the election. I hope this will happen eventually again, but right now we don't see it. So we do see the fatigue, we see lots of disputes and quarrels, and Max has also told you about the broad range of topics people quarreled about at the left side. So the left is divided too, and it will take a bit of time until they find together in order to continue and act together. There is another question concerning the rumors concerning Musk's Starling, which has allegedly been used in order to count voters' votes, and allegedly Musk knew about the results even 4 hours before they were officially announced. And I mean, not 4 hours before the election results were announced, but before the voting places closed. Max, may I ask you, will they recount? Do they talk about recounting the votes in Washington also? Because of the voting slips we've seen, some had been thrown away, others haven't been counted. Are there any intents to do something about it, Max?
No, and I would really question that notion. I think that's sort of, in some ways, disinformation. The idea that anyone knew, the voting beforehand, and we have an incredibly decentralized election system. The elections that were being run in many of the swing states were in democratically run states with Democratic governors, such as in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And I would really recommend people not go down rabbit holes of election conspiracy theories like we saw after the 2020 election. Unfortunately, this was a free and fair election, and Donald Trump won, and that is, I think, a blow to many on the progressive side. But it happens. There was the similar conspiracy theories after 2004 on the progressive side as well, when John Kerry did not beat George W. Bush, despite a lot of expectation on the Democratic side, despite the fact that the polling was, leaning in George W. Bush's favor. And so, no, I mean, I'm sure there's some irregularities. There's been issues. There were reports of Russian called-in bomb threats in various precincts, all of which happens in an election when in a country of more than 300 million people, when especially when most or a lot of people go to vote on the same day. But I think one thing maybe I'll just add is that one thing that gives me some hope about this election is that what was very different was that you had Republicans really pushing people to turn out to vote. And normally we think about elections as Democrats needing to get low propensity voters, people of color, African Americans, Hispanics to the polls. Well, what we saw in this election is Democrats actually held, it looks like, pretty well with their African American support, but lost a lot of support among Hispanics, and Republicans were very encouraging of people to use early voting and mail-in voting, other things that during 2020 Donald Trump opposed them doing. So when we think about traditional US style election suppression, what you oftentimes see is trying to decrease access to voting. And what's interesting about this election, which gives me some hope for the future, is that, well, if Republicans are going to have a more diverse coalition of low propensity voters, then actually access to voting is important. And that scrambles a bit some of the election suppression efforts that we have seen Republicans pursue in the past. Furthermore, the kind of traditional gerrymandering is what we call it, where you draw congressional districts to really advantage one party or the other. Now, I think this is very much disadvantaged Democrats in the past. What it looks like in this cycle is actually it's about even. So that means that Democrats have, I think, quite a good chance in 2026 of regaining the House and potentially the Senate as well. So I think there are some real warning signs about, I think, the future for civil society, what Trump plans to do with government, as Hannah noted, particularly with the Department of Justice and his enemies list and all of this. And so that's real concern. However, I do think that there's a dynamic where if Trump goes too far, that there will be a strong reaction to the country. And there are still legal protections that I hope the Supreme Court would still uphold, such as having elections. And if those happen, then I think what we're kind of in for is that in 2026, there'll be a reckoning with how Trump governs over the next 2 years. The other thing I would say is that I seriously doubt that Trump has a desire to run. Trump can't run again unless there's some changes of the Supreme Court or because there's a constitutional amendment against it. And if he did decide to run again, so could Barack Obama. So I think the notion that Donald Trump runs again, I think is fanciful. And that means that you're going to have someone that is not going to be, I think, all that focused on who wins in 2028 and who his successor is. And I could see a presidency that becomes a lame duck president very quickly, much like George W. Bush, frankly, in 2005, after a number of crises, quickly became a sort of persona non grata and saw his popularity collapse. So we shall see how things play out. It looks like it could be a very chaotic administration, but America's institutions are quite strong, and it will take a really strong push from Trump to, I think, Orbanize America. It may happen. It's happened in various states, so it's a real concern. But we will, I think, have to see how things play out.
Ja, vielen Dank. Wir haben jetzt noch zwei Fragen zu
Thank you
einmal
so much. There are two more questions about the cooperation, the intelligence cooperation between the EU and the United States. What do you think about that? The new director of the CIA, what do you think about him? And then the military in the US, is it really so depending on Donald Trump? Does anybody want to answer this question? Maybe I can start and then briefly, and then Max can continue more broadly. So with regard to the military, no, I won't say so. So looking at those who are there for decades, they have a certain ethos, and they are very much focused on democracy. And the question is, however, what will happen when the leading voices will be made redundant, when the structure is lost? And we see Pete Hegseth, who has been appointed a Fox News moderator, not exactly qualified for this position. He said that he wants to fire the Joint Chief of Staff and other executive positions. He wants to get rid of the personnel. So there will be a change, and they want to make the military more obedient, and there will be a lot of voices who will be opposed to that, but there is a trend, there is a dangerous trend, and I think the intentions are very clear behind that. And the second question about the intelligence, the cooperation, it was about the cooperation, and what do you think about it in the future now between the US and Europe? John Radcliffe is part of the MAGA world, and he is very loyal to Trump, standing very closely behind him. And during the first Trump administration, he was the director he had a directorial position too. So he is also part of this ideology, and there is, we know now that we cannot rely on the Trump administration when it comes to keeping secrets. We've seen that in the first term when there were classified documents who appeared in Lagomar in his Florida residence. So this is quite dangerous, and Germany and the EU have to think about that. But I'm sure Max knows way more about that and wants to add to this too.
Yeah, I think the appointment of John Radcliffe is somewhat concerning, in part because when he was Director of National Intelligence at the end of the Trump administration, he deliberately politicized intelligence in a way to try to impact the 2020 election. That was sort of well documented. And so the question is whether he's going to be a serious figure as CIA director, should he be confirmed. And what I mean by that is, does he treat the job as sort of calling, as we would describe it here, using a baseball term, balls and strikes, and calling things as they are? And so when it comes to intelligence sharing with Europe, and I think most importantly with Ukraine, because the US intelligence sharing with Ukraine has been utterly vital to Ukraine's ability to prosecute this war, to identify targets, to hit those targets. That has been incredibly valuable. And what has been pretty clear is that US intelligence on Russia is incredibly good, while European intelligence on Russia is probably not quite up to where it should be, especially if when you look at the lead up to the Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And so I would be very concerned about the US continuing to share intel with Europeans and with Ukraine in particular. I think that's going to be hopefully something that just continues to happen and is sort of happening beneath the radar and never really becomes a big political issue. And hopefully that continues. But this is where I would look, if I were a European, at the report from the former Finnish president Niinisto about European resilience and the need for Europe to do more to share its intelligence amongst countries and to be better prepared and have a better collective intelligence capacity.
Danke, Max. Wir haben jetzt noch einige Fragen. Die werden auch alle drankommen, keine Sorgen. Ich werde sie nur ein bisschen clustern.
Thank you so much, Max. There are more questions. We are going to cluster them because they are kind of overlapping. When it comes to the institutional apparatus, what are the perspectives? Federal employees, civil servants, will they oppose this orders that are given that go against the Constitution? They have sworn in and they have given an oath on the Constitution. But what is going to happen if they don't stick, certain measures don't stick to the Constitution? There will be opposition, and Trump and the right-wing movement, they've prepared for this. They have thought about this. They are prepared too. And there is a proposal with the Project 2025. Trump had tried to implement this before in the first term, and a lot of civil servants, he wants to change their roles, their positions into politically appointed positions so they can be made redundant more easily. And there was the target of 50,000 posts. So this would be a transformation, how this state, the administrative state works, because impartiality is an important issue. These are positions where you need experience and expertise. And whenever there was something done against their expertise or against the Constitution, there was, of course, then a response. Therefore, there is a strategy of the Republicans. Biden tried to pass a law, an executive order, to be clearer, in order to make this process longer and slower. But all these people that are going to step down, Max and I, we know people in our circles of friends, and we talk about that. People who are asking themselves, is it safe for me to live here, to continue to live in Washington? What can I do as something politically meaningful here under a Trump administration? So there will be people who will be made redundant or who will be muted. So this is quite an important issue. There is a question, Max, with regard to the Middle East. What do you think with regard to Trump about the evolution of the Middle East conflict? And what are the perspectives, the outlooks? And then the other question, what do you expect with regard to German politics, always in the context of Gaza?
So I think it's a great question. I think there's right now, I don't quite understand Netanyahu's strategy in Gaza, in particular. I have to say I'm not a Middle East expert, but I think there's a lot of confusion about what the objective is presently in Gaza. And there's some speculation here. I can't really judge how accurate it is, that the war was just sort of continuing until the election. And I think Donald Trump has basically signaled that he wants that war to end. And I think you'll have some more leverage with Netanyahu than perhaps President Biden. But that said, I think the appointment of Mike Huckabee as U.S. ambassador, there's a clear signal that the U.S. is now backing Israel's basically efforts to, I think, rule out a two-state solution in between Israel and Palestine. So I think I would be quite pessimistic about that working out well. That said, I think what we'll see is a very hawkish approach toward Iran, and a real effort to ramp up sanctions vis-a-vis Iran, and that could mean another clash with Europe over Iran. I also think there'll be an effort to work with Gulf states more closely. There was a bit of an estrangement during the Biden administration between U.S.-Saudi relations. But we'll see what that means in regards to global oil prices and the global oil market. There has been some thoughts here that if you were to do stronger sanctions against Russia's energy sector, presently we don't really have many, and if that were to increase global oil prices, that increase Saudi production could offset the kind of energy impact or the oil price impact that might occur. We'll see what happens, but I think for many of the Middle East autocrats, this is Trump winning is a sort of welcome. Is they welcome that and hope to have better relations with the U.S. I don't quite know to what end. I do think that with Iran, there'll be a lot of pushing, but ultimately Donald Trump does not want to have a war with Iran. I think the Iranians really don't want to have a war with the United States or with Israel right now, particularly after Hezbollah has been, in some ways, really struck down by Israeli attacks.
Hanna, willst du vielleicht noch hinzufügen, wie sich das auf die deutsche Politik auswirken könnte gegenüber Gaza?
Gerne, also mein Eindruck,
Hannah, you'd like to answer with regard to the German context? Yeah, I totally agree with Max. So Trump will offer Netanyahu quite a backing, and this will not change the politics in Israel. Mark Huckabee is from a very religious background. He identifies as a Christian Zionist. This is one of the most important interest groups in the US behind all this, and I don't see a huge change that the US will pressure for something else. But the escalation with Iran, I don't think they want to trigger this further. I coincide with Max, and Saudi Arabia is also close to Trump. There is a personal friendship with the Crown Prince and Trump, and they have their own interests, and they're not interested in an escalation either. Thank you so much. We have two more questions about the rise of the inflation, the tariffs on China, and what impact it will have on MAGA. And then the second question, and this is also supposed to be the last one, this is of a more general nature. What should Germany do with regard to Trump? Wolfgang Ischer from the Munich Security Conference, he said we have to get close to Trump and feed his narcissism. But then there is also the question: what should we really welcome him without being very critical? Max, maybe you'd like to start first, or I can start first. With regard to Germany and Germany's relationship with the US. The ambassadors here in Washington, they are already reflecting on that, and there is no perfect answer, that's for sure. So autocrats with Trump, I think it's not helpful to do what they want to become obedient. We have to have red lines. You don't need to address them publicly. You can do this behind closed doors, but it doesn't help to give him a huge hug and kill him with kindness. And there are possibilities. There is transactional work. You can try to have deals wherever this is possible, but it's not always doable if you have to leave behind your own values. And this may put Germany and Europe into very narrow situations, and also with regard to Ukraine, and there aren't any easy answers, I'd say.
Max,
Yeah,
möchtest du auch?
Max?
I think
Yeah.
when it comes to the inflation and tariffs and the economy, President Trump is about to inherit an incredibly strong economy with inflation down, growth high, and stock market doing well. So the economy will be doing quite well, and we'll see what happens with tariffs. I think the general thought is that is going to have that's going to increase prices without really increasing manufacturing jobs. The mass deportation effort, in particular, could have a really upset the U.S. labor market. If you think about our agricultural sector, and if you have to pay people more to pick strawberries, well, then the price of strawberries go up. And so I think there will be some real cost impacts, some real impacts on companies. And so the question with all of this, with the kind of radical agenda that we see being laid out by Trump and many of Trump's supporters, is how much of it becomes reality. And I think that will, hit up against some the political realities, economic realities. But I think on the migration side, they're going to be very earnest about going about it. And so that could have, I think, real blowback politically, because I don't think people, when they voted for quote unquote mass deportation, didn't think that it meant, anyone named Sanchez. They thought it was directed at not them, but others, and not going to impact them. Well, if prices go up everywhere and it's really hard to hire anyone to do anything, to clean your house, at restaurants, and prices are going up because immigrant labor is runs America, and that has been the case for an incredibly long time, going back centuries. And it used to be Germans and Italians, and now it's oftentimes people from Central and South America. So that, I think, is going to be really problematic. When it comes to Wolfgang Ischinger, maybe just quickly, the idea that flattering Donald Trump will work. I mean, maybe it might. It's worth a try. But I think if your strategy as a country is you're going to come and just try to flatter Donald Trump, and especially if you're Germany, I think you're in for a very rude awakening, and I think that's frankly a foolish approach. And that a serious country like Germany needs to have a very serious approach. It needs to actually take itself seriously, and Europe needs to take itself seriously. That Europe is very strong. You're 450 million people when you act as one, and have resources to act. And we saw during the first Trump administration is the EU actually came in with Jean-Claude Juncker and was very strong towards the Trump White House and issuing retaliatory tariffs back at Washington. And that, I think, simmered things down. And that if Europe is weak and comes on the bended knee and says, Donald Trump, you're the greatest, I can't believe you won, you're so amazing, I think we will perceive that as Americans, not just as Trump, as European fecklessness. So I would say, don't be weak and feckless, be strong, and that will be respected. And so I would actually very much push back on just flattery is how this will be, how Europe will sort of get through the next 4 years.
Vielen Dank, Max. Ich glaube, das waren sehr wichtige letzte Worte.
Thank you so much. I think these were quite important last remarks. Unfortunately, we are ending this event. There are lots of topics we could continue to debate on. We, as a foundation, we will continue to look into the election and the election results. We should take this very seriously. There is an election dossier, and it's online and with events, and I'd like to remind you of that. And in order to wrap everything up, thank you so much, Max. Thank you so much, Hannah. Thank you so much, Alexandra. And thank you so much to our audience and all our staff who made this possible. Thank you so much also to our translators, and see you very soon. soon, hopefully. I wish you a wonderful day, and Hannah and Max and the Europeans have a lovely afternoon. Thank you so much. Bye.